built Hargrove & Sons plumbing supply out of a rented garage on the east side of Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1987. Not a metaphor, an actual garage, 16 feet wide with a water stain on the ceiling shaped like the state of Florida, and a space heater that smelled like burning rubber every time the temperature dropped below 40. My wife thought I was having a midlife crisis at 34. I told her I was just getting started. By the time I was 63, that garage had become 4 warehouses, a fleet of 12 delivery trucks, and contracts with every major commercial builder in the Tulsa metro area. We supplied pipe fittings, valves, fixtures, and specialty equipment to contractors from as far north as Bartlesville, down to McAllister. The company had 11 full-time employees, 2 part-time drivers, and an annual revenue that made my accountant smile every April. I knew every client by name. I knew their coffee orders. I knew which ones called on Fridays looking for a favor, and which ones paid net 30 without being asked. My son had been with the company for 9 years. I want to be careful here, because I spent a long time after everything happened trying to figure out where I went wrong. Whether I missed something, whether I was so focused on building the business that I built him wrong too. I don't have a clean answer to that. What I can tell you is that the boy I raised and the man who sat across from me that Tuesday morning in March were not the same person. Or maybe they were, and I just hadn't been paying attention. His name is Lyle, named after my father, which is something I've had complicated feelings about ever since. Lyle came into the company at 27, fresh out of a business program at OU. I was proud of him. I gave him the operations manager title and a salary that was, frankly, more generous than his experience warranted. I told myself I was investing in his future. That was partly true. The other part was that I wanted him there. I wanted to hand something down. I had built this thing with my hands and my credit and 20 years of 7-day weeks, and I wanted it to mean something beyond just a number on a balance sheet. I wanted my son to want it. For the first few years, it was good. He learned the inventory system. He built relationships with some of the younger contractors. He had ideas about streamlining the delivery routes that actually saved us money. I started letting him handle the vendor negotiations, and he was sharper than I expected. I told my wife one night over dinner that I thought we were going to be okay, that the handoff was going to work. Then he married Shelby. I am not going to blame everything on my daughter-in-law. That would be too easy, and it would let Lyle off the hook in a way he doesn't deserve. But I would be lying if I said her arrival didn't change the temperature in that office. She had opinions about the company before she had ever set foot inside a warehouse. She told Lyle, and Lyle told me, as if it were a reasonable thing to repeat, that a business our size should have a professional management structure, that I was running it like a family shop, that the growth was being limited by my reluctance to modernize. She wasn't entirely wrong about the modernizing part. I'll give her that. But there is a difference between offering a suggestion and deciding you already own the place. Over the next 2 years, things shifted in ways that were hard to name while they were happening. Lyle started arriving late to meetings I had called and on time to ones he had called without telling me. Vendors started receiving emails from him that I hadn't approved. Small things, the kind of thing you chalk up to growing pains, to a son finding his footing, to the normal friction of a father who built something, and a son who wants to leave his own mark on it. I made excuses. Fathers do that. The Tuesday in March started like most Tuesdays. I drove in from home, stopped at the Quick Trip on 41st for a large coffee, and got to the office by 7:15. My operations coordinator, a woman named Patricia who had been with me for 14 years, was already at her desk. She gave me a look when I walked in that I didn't know how to read at the time. I thought she was just tired. Lyle was in the conference room. So was a man I didn't recognize who turned out to be an attorney from a firm downtown I had never heard of. And so was my brother-in-law, Walt, my late wife's brother, who had inherited 12% of the company when she passed 4 years ago, and who had, as far as I knew, always been content to receive his quarterly distributions and leave the operations to me. Walt wouldn't look at me. Lyle placed a document on the table and slid it across. Not slowly, the way people do when they're nervous. Quickly, the way people do when they've practiced. He said, Dad, we've been talking about the future of the company. Walt and I, and some advisors, we think it's time for a leadership transition. This outlines a buyout of your shares at fair market value and a consulting arrangement for the next 12 months. I looked at the document. I looked at Walt. I looked at my son. I said, "Give me the weekend." He said, "We'd like an answer today." I picked up the document, folded it once, and put it in the inside pocket of my jacket. Then I stood up, took my coffee, and walked out of the conference room. I did not raise my voice. I did not say anything I would regret. I walked to my office, sat down at my desk, and looked at the photograph on the wall. Me and Lyle at the grand opening of the second warehouse in 2009. Him 15 years old and grinning with a pair of oversized scissors. I sat there for probably 3 minutes. Then I got up, took my personal files from the bottom drawer, put them in the canvas bag I kept on the back of my door, and left the building. Patricia said my name as I passed her desk. I said, "I'll call you this week." I drove to the Quick Trip on 41st and sat in the parking lot and drank the rest of my coffee. Here is what I want you to understand about the next 8 weeks. I was not acting out of anger. I want to be clear about that because anger would have made me sloppy, and I could not afford to be sloppy. What I felt sitting in that parking lot was something closer to clarity. The kind of clarity you get when a situation you have been half seeing for a long time suddenly comes fully into focus. I have been watching this develop for 2 years and telling myself it wasn't what it looked like. Now I knew what it looked like. And I knew what it looked like. And I knew what I had to do. The first call I made was to my attorney, a man named Gordon who had handled my business affairs for 20 years. I told him what had happened. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Don't sign anything. Don't respond to anything. Come see me Monday morning." I spent that weekend going through my files. I owned 51% of Hargrove & Sons Plumbing Supply. Lyle owned 37%. Walt owned 12%. For Lyle to force any kind of ownership transfer, he needed Walt's shares, and he needed a legal mechanism that didn't exist as long as I was a functioning majority shareholder who had committed no breach of the operating agreement. The document he slid across the table was an offer, not a fait accompli. He had made it look like a demand because he was counting on me to be rattled, to feel outnumbered in that room and sign something before I had time to think. I had not signed anything. Monday morning, Gordon and I went through the operating agreement line by line. What we found, what Gordon had actually built into that agreement back in 2001 when I first brought on outside investors and then bought them back out, was a right of first refusal clause and a provision that any transfer of shares above 5% required approval from the majority holder, which was me, which meant that even if Walt wanted to sell his shares to Lyle, I could block it or match the price. And even if they somehow consolidated their shares, they needed 60% to force a leadership change under the terms we had written. They had 49%. They were one short of being able to do anything. Gordon said, "They either didn't read the agreement carefully, or they thought you hadn't." I think they thought I hadn't. But here's the thing about what I found when I kept looking. The operating agreement protected my position. It did not protect the company from being hollowed out slowly while I was distracted. And I had been distracted. Over the previous 18 months, Lyle had been quietly shifting vendor relationships. 3 of our largest suppliers, 2 in Wichita, 1 in Dallas, had been moved to direct accounts under a new LLC that Lyle had incorporated 8 months ago. He had not hidden it. He had just done it without mentioning it. And I had not been watching closely enough to catch it. The LLC was named Meridian Pipe and Supply. Shelby was listed as the registered agent. That told me everything I needed to know about the timeline. I did not call Lyle that week. I did not respond to the attorney's follow-up email. I let the silence stretch out, and I paid attention to what happened in the silence. What happened was that Patricia started receiving calls from contractors asking about order delays. What happened was that 2 of our delivery drivers mentioned that Lyle had asked them, separately, whether they would consider staying on if the company went through some changes. What happened was that one of our longest-standing clients, a commercial contractor named Pete, who had been doing business with us since 1994, called me on my cell and said, "I heard there might be some instability over there. Just want to know if I should be worried about my spring orders." Pete had heard from Lyle's sales contact. It was deliberate. I want to pause here and tell you something about how I was raised. My father, the original Lyle, the one my son is named after, was a man who did not believe in fighting in the open if you could avoid it. He was a cattle farmer from Osage County, and he had a saying I heard probably 100 times growing up: a man who announces his move has already lost half of it. I thought about that a lot in those 8 weeks. I thought about the conference room and the document slid across the table like it was already settled. Lyle had announced his move. He had brought a lawyer and a family member to a room and put paper in front of me. He had expected me to crumble because he thought the size of the gesture would override whatever leverage I actually had. I had not announced anything. The first thing I did was call Pete back and have a conversation I should have had years earlier. I told him I was planning to restructure, that I was moving toward a model with a smaller operational footprint and a tighter client base, and that I would be honoring every existing contract personally. He appreciated the directness. He asked if I was opening a new entity. I told him I was considering it and would keep him informed. The new entity was already in progress. Gordon helped me incorporate GS Supply Partners in the second week of April. The name came from my initials and nothing else. No family name, no history attached to it. Nothing Lyle could point to and claim was derivative of what we had built together. I opened a commercial account at a bank I had never used for Hargrove business. I reached out quietly to 2 of the Wichita vendors who had not been moved to Meridian. I explained my situation, and I offered them terms that were better than what Hargrove had been paying, because I was starting clean and I could afford to be generous in the short term. Both vendors agreed to supply GS partners within 30 days. The harder conversation was with Patricia. I drove to her house on a Saturday morning in late April, and sat at her kitchen table and told her everything. She was 61 years old and had been with me longer than some of my vendors. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I have always admired about her. When I finished, she poured us both more coffee and said, I had a feeling something like this was happening. He started asking me for the client contact list 2 months ago. I told him it was in the system. I asked her if she would come with me. She said, I already submitted my resignation last Friday. I just hadn't told you where I was going yet. By the first week of May, I had 5 of Hargrove's 11 employees who had quietly indicated they would follow me to GS Partners. Not because I had recruited them improperly. I was careful about that, because poaching your own employees while you're still a majority shareholder raises legal complications I did not want. I simply told people I was starting something new, and I told them the terms, and I let them decide. 4 of the 5 were the ones who actually ran the day-to-day operations. The other 7, mostly newer hires, stayed with Hargrove, which was fine. Hargrove was going to need people. For a little while anyway. I want to tell you about the moment I understood how fully Lyle had misread the situation. It was a Thursday evening in mid-May. I was at the new GS Partners location, a leased unit in a commercial complex in Broken Arrow, considerably smaller than what I was used to, but clean and workable. And I got a call from Gordon. He told me that Lyle had approached a private equity group out of Oklahoma City about acquiring a majority stake in Hargrove & Sons. The pitch, as Gordon had heard it from a contact at the firm, was that the founder was stepping back, and the company was positioned for growth under new management. The PE firm had done preliminary due diligence. What they found was that 3 of Hargrove's top 5 clients had quietly shifted their primary supplier relationships in the past 60 days, that the 2 most experienced operations staff had resigned, that the vendor contracts covering roughly 40% of the product catalog were either expired or in renegotiation, that the company's trailing 12-month revenue had declined meaningfully from the prior year. The PE firm passed. Lyle called me for the first time in 6 weeks that same night. I did not answer. He called 3 more times before midnight. I did not answer any of them. I sat on the back porch of my house in the dark and listened to the frogs down by the creek and thought about the grand opening photograph on the wall of the office I no longer went to. I thought about the boy with the oversized scissors. I thought about what I could have done differently and whether it would have mattered, and I decided that it probably wouldn't have, and that I needed to stop asking the question. The next morning, I sent a single text message to Lyle's number. It said, when you're ready to talk, I'm available between 9 and 11 on weekdays. Call Gordon's office to schedule. He called Gordon's office that afternoon. The meeting was 2 weeks later, in a conference room at Gordon's firm. Not the Hargrove conference room, not anywhere with history attached to it. Lyle came alone. He looked like he hadn't been sleeping. Shelby had apparently told him not to come, that it was a trap. But he had come anyway, and I gave him some credit for that. He did not apologize. I did not expect him to. What he said was, "I didn't think you'd actually walk away." I said, "I didn't walk away from anything. I took everything with me that was mine to take." He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "What do you want?" I had thought about this carefully. What I wanted was not revenge in the petty sense. I did not want him humiliated. I did not want Shelby investigated. I did not want to watch the company I had built go under just to prove a point. What I wanted was an accurate accounting of what had been taken and what I was owed, and a clean separation that left me free to build GS Partners without the distraction of ongoing litigation. Gordon had prepared an offer. It involved Lyle purchasing my remaining 51% at a price that reflected the company's diminished state, significantly less than it would have been worth 8 months earlier, before the vendor erosion and the client departures, plus a formal release of any claims related to Meridian Pipe and Supply, in exchange for my agreement not to pursue legal action over the unauthorized vendor transfers. Lyle asked if he could have a few days to review it. Gordon said, "Take the time you need." He called back in 4 days and accepted. I signed the transfer paperwork on a Wednesday afternoon in early June. Gordon handed me the pen, and I signed my name, and that was the end of 37 years. I want to tell you it felt like something significant, and it did, but not in the way I expected. It felt less like a door closing, and more like setting down something heavy I had been carrying for a long time. My back actually felt different driving home. I'm serious. My shoulders were lower. GS Partners opened its full commercial operations on July 7th. Patricia managed the front office. I hired a young man named Carlos who had worked as a warehouse supervisor for a competitor and who knew the product catalog better than people twice his experience. Pete came over immediately and brought 2 other contractors with him. By the end of the first quarter, we had 11 commercial accounts and a vendor network that was, frankly, better curated than what Hargrove had been working with. I heard through mutual contacts that Lyle was struggling, that Shelby had pushed him toward another PE pitch and that it had gone nowhere, that he had let 3 more employees go. I did not feel good about this. I want to be honest about that. He is still my son, and whatever he did and whatever I think of the choices he made, watching something fail that has your name on it is not a clean feeling. I called him once in October just to check in. He was civil. We talked for about 10 minutes about nothing in particular. He did not ask about the business, and I did not offer. There's a younger contractor I work with now, guy just starting out, who asked me once how I had handled it all. He had heard some version of the story through the industry grapevine, and he wanted to know what advice I would give someone in a similar situation. I told him that the most dangerous thing I had done was build the company in a way that made me feel indispensable to it. That when you build something that only works because of what's in your head and your relationships and your reputation, you can't actually be pushed out. But the person trying to push you out doesn't know that until they try. I also told him, don't put your name on anything you're not willing to carry forever. The name was always the least important part. GS Partners just finished its 3rd year. We have 16 employees. We operate out of 2 locations, the original Broken Arrow unit and a newer facility in South Tulsa that Patricia helped me find. We have 31 active commercial accounts. We are, by every measure that matters to me, exactly what I wanted Hargrove to become before I stopped paying attention to what was happening inside my own house. The plaque that used to hang in the Hargrove conference room, the one that said founded 1987, built to last. I saw it in a Facebook marketplace listing last spring. Someone was selling it for $40. I thought about buying it for a long time. In the end, I didn't. Some things are better left where they land. I am 66 years old. I get to work by 7:15 most mornings. I still stop at the Quick Trip on 41st. The coffee is still the same. I've had a lot of time to think about what actually happened, Not just the events themselves, the conference room, the lawyer, the documents slid across the table, but the deeper current running underneath all of it. The part that took me longer to see clearly. What Lyle did wasn't an accident. It wasn't a moment of poor judgment or a bad idea that spiraled. It was the result of a long pattern of choices, small ones made over years, each one a little further from honest and a little closer to entitled. And I played a role in that. I'm not saying I deserved what he tried to do. I'm saying that when you hand someone everything without requiring them to understand what it cost, you create a very specific kind of blindness in them. They start to believe the value was always theirs, that your role in building it was incidental, that the thing exists independent of the person who made it exist. That's not cruelty necessarily. That's just what happens when effort is invisible for long enough. The lesson I keep coming back to is not about business structure or operating agreements, though those things matter, and I would tell any business owner to read their own documents more carefully than I read mine. The deeper lesson is about what I'd call moral clarity under pressure. When Lyle put that document in front of me and expected me to crumble, what he was really counting on was that I would let fear override my judgment. Fear of conflict, fear of losing the relationship, fear of what it would mean to fight my own son. And I won't pretend those fears weren't there. They were. They sat with me in that Quick Trip parking lot for a full hour. But I had built something real for 37 years, not just a business. A track record of showing up, of doing what I said I would do, of being someone that Pete and Patricia and a dozen other people had trusted with their livelihoods. That doesn't evaporate because someone slides a piece of paper across a table. Character is what you've actually done, accumulated over time. You can't transfer it, you can't forge it, you can't sell it to a private equity firm out of Oklahoma City. Lyle got the name. He got the filing number and the letterhead. What he didn't get, what he couldn't get, was any of the things that made the name worth something in the first place. I think about Patricia driving to work at the new Broken Arrow location, and I think about Carlos knowing the product catalog cold, and I think about Pete bringing two of his contractor friends over without being asked. None of that happened because of a legal document. It happened because of years of small, consistent choices to do right by people. That's not something you can acquire in a takeover. It follows the person, not the entity. The hardest part wasn't the business. The hardest part wasn't the business. The hardest part was accepting that my son made choices I couldn't undo for him. I raised him. I worked alongside him. I gave him more than he was ready for. And in the end, he made the decisions he made. That belongs to him. What I did with what came after belongs to me. And what I did was keep going. Not out of spite. Not to prove anything to anyone. Just because that's who I am and who I have always been. And nobody in a conference room with a lawyer gets to change that. GS Partners just finished its 3rd year. I am 66 years old, and I still get to work by 7:15. Some things, it turns out, you really do take with you.